Hi everyone, welcome to our event today. So myself and Dr. Heather Walbers are going to be running through some of the findings of a large survey we did of Australian mobile dating app and website users to understand the prevalence of sexual harassment and violence and their experiences of receiving requests to facilitate child sexual exploitation. So it's no surprise that mobile dating apps and dating websites are really popular. I'm sure everyone's either used one themselves or knows someone that uses one or has used one in the past. In fact, last year there was about an eighth of our country who used them, with over 3 million users. And it's actually become the most common way that people are meeting new partners and forming intimate relationships. And although it seems to be much skewed towards the younger populations, where most people are in their 20s and 30s. It's not exclusive to this sort of age range. There's specific apps designed for people in their 40s and 50s and 60s. So really anyone of any age can use them. And there's no sort of argument that dating apps and websites have forged really strong intimate relationships between people. There's quite a few positives to them, where people who might struggle to meet each other organically in natural situations might struggle, and dating apps can actually allow them a way to do this. And this is a real positive, particularly for people who've been marginalised in the past and still are in some areas, say, for example, the LGBT plus community, where they may struggle to meet each other face to face, and dating apps can allow them a way to match with people and start forming these sort of relationships. And it's not only this community, but also people in rural and remote areas. Dating apps and websites allow them to cast a much wider net and potentially communicate and meet people and form relationships where they may not otherwise have had the ability to do so. But despite these positives, which a lot of people are quite aware of, there's also a pretty obvious big elephant in the room, where a lot of people who are meeting each other on dating apps and websites, the result of which is actually sexual assault and violence. And it's not really exclusive to any country in particular. A very quick search in Google and news sites will come across countless headlines. This is just a sort of quick collection that we could come up with. And as we can see here, it's not exclusive to just Australia. It's also found in the United States and the UK. And it's not just anecdotal evidence in this sort of way that's really highlighting the fact that dating apps and websites can lead to sexual violence. There's also some emerging empirical literature and research looking into this, but this research has yet to really dig into whether this violence is occurring on the app itself or after these people are meeting each other face to face. And it really hasn't delved into other issues such as child exploitation and human trafficking and that sort of thing. And it's not just that these apps aren't aware that this is happening. These apps do know this is happening, and a lot of them are starting to implement a lot of safety mechanisms and that sort of thing to help improve the security and safety of their users. Say, for example, Tinder, which is probably the most popular app. In the last couple of years, they implemented a verification feature whereby people can send a photo of themselves off the Tinder, and then Tinder can confirm whether the person on this profile matches up with the photos on their profile. Basically, and then after that is confirmed, there's a little blue check mark that appears in their profile. And this can just sort of help instill a bit more confidence in people who are talking to this person that they are who they say they are. But unfortunately, that's all well and good. But if that person is so inclined to engage in sexual violence in person, if they then meet people offline, the safety mechanisms on the app can't really prevent that sort of in-person harm from happening, and the app's facilitated that connection. So we've set out at the ARC in the last year to do a big survey of Australians to better understand the sort of prevalence of this sort of dating app facilitated sexual violence. So we did a large survey, representative Australians 18 plus who used mobile dating apps rather than being representative of the entire Australian population. So I'll just get into how we did this very briefly. So starting mid last year, we procured the services of Roy Morgan, which is a market research company. and they did an initial survey of about 1,000 people using our survey instrument to better understand the sort of prevalence and propensities of people to use dating apps and websites. Typically, when we're getting a representative sample, we'll go and look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS data, and look at the spread across the population of people in certain ages, of certain genders, in certain locations. And then after you can sample that, you can then extrapolate out to make the data representative of the wider Australian population. But this ABS population data that we had, Roy Morgan then refined that based upon their propensity scores that they obtained in that first survey of 1,000 people. And then using this, they were able to come up with a sort of quota where they knew they need to sample, say, for example, more younger people in urban areas, as these are people who are more likely to use dating apps. After this, they would then use this quota, went out to 2 other survey companies and obtained about 9,000 more responses. And then after removing any of these nonsense responses or duplicates, we ended up with a sample just shy of 10,000 people. And as I mentioned, it's representative of Australians who use mobile dating apps and websites. As a result of this sort of quota-based sampling, our data's skewed a bit away from what we typically see of the wider Australian population. So as you can see, a lot more of our target population is 34 or under, and a lot less of our target population is 50 or older as compared to the Australian population. So just going through a bit of the sort of the descriptive stats of our sample, as we can see in the map, the spread of respondents to our survey is typically representative of the Australian population, where most people are located across the eastern seaboard in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and then less of the proportion of the sample in Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, the ACT, and Northern Territory. About 82% of our sample reported being heterosexual, roughly evenly split between men and women, and about 15% reported being LGBT+, again, roughly evenly split between men and women, and just under 1% of our sample reported being non-binary. Now, I'm just going to touch on a limitation of our data here before I get into a little bit more. We asked respondents about their gender and their reported sexual orientation, whether it was heterosexual or not. So we're really limited and constrained in some ways, where we can't really comment on the experiences of some populations that have typically been indicated to be a lot more vulnerable to these sorts of online harms, particularly the transgender population. So as a result, our data is sort of disaggregated in these ways you can see down here on the right, simply looking at experiences of men and women, the LGBT+ population or not, whether it's a heterosexual, and those non-binary individuals. About 8% of our sample reported being First Nations, about 30% said they had a disability, just under 9% said they came from a non-English speaking background, and about 1/5 of the sample said that they were located in regional or remote areas across Australia. Now, we asked a few questions across a range of domains in this survey to get a really comprehensive understanding about this sort of sexual violence being facilitated through mobile dating apps. So we've looked at these socio-demographic characteristics, as I mentioned above, but also looked at the characteristics of our respondents' use of mobile dating apps in the last 5 years. So this included things like their frequency of use, the number of apps they used, which apps in particular they used, what sort of relationships they were seeking to find out of these apps, whether or not they purchased any subscriptions, and that sort of thing. And then we tapped into respondents' experiences of sexual harassment, aggression, and violence, whether this occurred online and in person, whether respondents were sent requests to facilitate child sexual exploitation from other users, and attempts to recruit them into exploitative conditions, which is really looking at that sort of human trafficking and modern slavery lens as well. We also looked at respondents' experiences of reporting any sort of online or offline harm that they experienced, but unfortunately this is limited to that domain of sexual harassment, aggression, and violence. So again, I just want to comment on some limitations before we start talking about some of the findings that we had. So in terms of commenting on the data, it's really limited to the gender and sexual identity of respondents, as I mentioned before. We're really limited as well in our ability to look at the perpetration of this sort of harm as well. So not only did we not ask respondents if they'd engaged in this sort of behaviour toward other people on these apps, but we also didn't ask respondents any questions about the people who were perpetrating these sort of harms against them. So we're really limited in our ability to comment on who are the perpetrators of this sort of sexual violence as well. And additionally, although I mentioned that we collected data on the specific apps and websites that people said that they used, we unfortunately can't link any victimization experiences to these specific apps and websites, as the victimization questions were separate to the demographic questions looking at their use of apps.
So the first report that emerged with the survey data that Cohen explained is on the sexual harassment, aggression and violence victimization amongst the mobile dating app and website users. So we're calling it dating app facilitated sexual violence. And we kind of looked broadly at two different types of this kind of harm, which was online and in person. So the online dating app facilitated sexual violence included behaviours that respondents experienced online. We asked about 14 different behaviours, and we put this into 4 different categories just to make it a bit more manageable. So the first category is online sexual harassment, which included things like the respondent saying that the perpetrator continued to contact them when they expressed that they weren't interested in a relationship. The second type of online dating app facilitated sexual violence was abusive and threatening language. Then we had online image-based sexual abuse, which included somebody taking or sharing non-consensual images or videos of a sexual nature. And finally, online stalking, which included somebody pressuring them to send their location or their schedule information. For the in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, this included behaviours that somebody experienced when they met up with somebody that they had met through a dating app or website. And we limited this to the last 5 years, as with online dating app facilitated sexual violence. We asked about 8 different behaviours, and we put this into the 4 categories as well. So we have sexual assault and coercion, which included things like somebody using physical force to coerce somebody into engaging in a sex act. Then there was reproductive and sexual health related abuse, which included things like stealthing, which is when somebody removes their condom or refuses to wear a condom during sex, or lying about their sexual health status. The third category was in-person image-based sexual abuse, which was, again, photos and videos that were non-consensually taken or shared in person. And finally, in-person stalking, which included somebody loitering around or following them or showing up inappropriately. So looking at the online dating app facilitated sexual violence, overall we did find that 72.3% of respondents had been subjected to at least one form of this harm in the last 5 years. Looking at the 4 different types, so 69% of people said that they were sexually harassed. 45.5% of people said that they had been subjected to abusive and threatening language. Just over a quarter said that they had been stalked online, and 18.8% said that they had been subjected to online image-based sexual abuse. We broke this down by the gender and sexual identities of the respondents. And as you can see, the LGBT+ females had the highest prevalence of experiencing online dating app facilitated sexual violence. This was closely followed by non-binary respondents, and then LGBT+ males and heterosexual females. And while the heterosexual males did have the lowest prevalence, 61.5% is still quite a high rate of experiencing these harms. When we broke this down further by the 4 different types of online dating app facilitated sexual violence, again, we did find that LGBT+ females were experiencing quite high prevalences in comparison to the other gender and sexual identity groups that we examined. For online image-based sexual abuse and online stalking, we did find that non-binary respondents did have a slightly higher prevalence of experiencing those types of online dating app facilitated sexual violence. What we did next was we added up the number of behaviours. So remember that there was 14 behaviours that we asked about for online dating app facilitated sexual violence. So we added them together for the respondents, and we found that 60.8% of the respondents said that they had experienced multiple types of behaviours, so 2 or more of the harmful behaviours that we asked about. Also, a quarter of people said that they experienced 7 or more, so very frequent or very diverse types of harmful experiences for a large number of people. The average number of behaviours experienced was 4. However, when you break this down by the gender and sexual identities of respondents, you can see that, again, LGB plus females were experiencing a higher number of behaviours, so 5.7 on average. So not only are the LGB plus females experiencing the highest prevalence of harm, so that they're more commonly experiencing the harm, they are experiencing more types of harm as well. So moving now to the in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, we found that just over a third of the respondents said that they experienced at least one form of in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence in the last 5 years. Breaking this down by the 4 different types, 27.3 said that they had been sexually assaulted or coerced. 18.8% had been subjected to reproductive and sexual health related abuse. 14.3% had been stalked in person, and 10.5% had been subjected to in-person image-based sexual abuse. Looking closer at the sexual assault and coercion, there were 4 behaviours that fell into this category. And we found that 22% of people said that somebody had pressured them verbally to perform an unwanted sex act. We found that 15.8% said that somebody had attempted to engage in a sex act when they could not consent. And 13% said that somebody had used physical violence to make them engage in a sex act. And the last behaviour was somebody spiking their drink to get them to perform a sex act, and 10% of people said that this had happened to them. So for each of the behaviours that we asked about for all types of harm, so the 22 behaviours, we asked whether one person had perpetrated that against them or multiple people. So the example here is for the behaviour attempted to engage in a sex act when they could not consent. So for this behaviour, 10% of people said that one person had done this to them, and 5.5% said that multiple people had done this to them. So you can see that people are being repeatedly victimised. And this was kind of consistent across all of the behaviours that we asked about, where the majority of people were saying that one person had done it, but still quite a sizable proportion said that it was perpetrated by multiple different people. So when we broke down the overall prevalence for in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence by the gender and sexual identities of the respondents, again, the LGB plus females were experiencing the highest prevalence of harm. So you can see that almost half of these respondents said that something had happened out of the 8 behaviours that we had asked about. This was again closely followed by the LGB plus males, the non-binary respondents, and then the heterosexual females, and then males. And again, while the heterosexual males is quite low, you can see over a quarter of heterosexual males experienced this, which is still very high. Breaking it down by the different types of in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, we see that both the LGB plus males and females had the highest prevalence across each of the 4 types. So the males, however, had the highest prevalence for the reproductive and sexual health related abuse, the in-person image-based sexual abuse, and the in-person stalking. So they had slightly higher prevalences for those types of harm, whereas the LGB plus females had the highest prevalence for sexual assault and coercion. When we summed together the 8 different behaviours for in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, we found that 22.7% of people experienced multiple types of these behaviours. And you can also see that 6% of people experienced 7 or 8, which is in essence the full spectrum of the behaviours that we asked about. And the average was 1, so people were on average experiencing 1.1 of the behaviours. However, we see quite a different story when we break it down by the gender and sexual identities. So we see that the LGB plus males and females were experiencing more behaviours on average, so 1.8 and 1.7. So far I've talked about the online and the in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence kind of separately. However, we did look at how they co-occurred. So this pie chart shows all of the people that experienced at least one of the behaviours that we had asked about. And we found that 44.8% of people who experienced dating app facilitated sexual violence experienced both online and in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence. 53.7% said they only experienced it online, and 1.5% of people said they only experienced it in person. And that kind of means that if somebody has experienced in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, it's very likely that they have also experienced it online. So next we asked people about kind of what happened after the dating app facilitated sexual violence occurred. So we asked them specifically whether the perpetrator had blocked them, had unmatched them, or had deleted their account. And the reason we asked about this is because anecdotally this was reported as a common tactic to kind of cover up what had occurred by deleting the conversation history. So we asked about this, and following online dating app facilitated sexual violence, just under 40% of people said that they were subsequently blocked, unmatched, or that the aggressor had deleted their account. For in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, we found that just under half of the respondents said that this had happened. And you can see it's a little bit higher for in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence. And we did hypothesize that this might be because of the perpetrator's perception of, their likelihood of being reported or, facing consequences for what had happened. And we also asked for this question whether one person had done it or multiple people, and we see that quite a sizable proportion here said that multiple people had used this tactic following dating app facilitated sexual violence. So all of the prevalences, they're pretty high, very concerning. There are things that we can do and that the apps are working on, as Cohen pointed out a few different examples. So safety by design, very important. So some of the tools that can be used by dating apps include ensuring that the reporting mechanisms are accessible. So obviously, if it's very, very difficult to report and you can't find the link, you're less likely to report something that has happened. And that makes it difficult to then identify the problematic users and remove them to stop them from future offending against other users. It also makes it harder to identify victims or people who have had harmful experiences and offer them support. So ensuring that those reporting mechanisms are easy is very important. Secondly, identity verifications. So this helps in a number of ways. So for example, if there is a problematic user and they have been removed from the service, this kind of stops them from signing up again and creating a new account. Also, some apps use AI to censor explicit images. And what this does is it will kind of blur the image if it believes it's a sexually explicit image. And then that allows the person that's receiving the image to decide whether they want to view that image or not. So also the dating apps and websites should continue to monitor the impact of these safety strategies. So in some cases, safety strategies can be exploited by users. So for example, being able to block someone or unmatch with someone is an important safety feature because it stops somebody continuing to contact you if they are being harmful. However, as I mentioned earlier, it can delete the conversation history, and so that in a way is being exploited. However, a lot of apps have moved away from that and do retain the conversation history now. So in summary, 3 in 4 respondents had experienced online dating app facilitated sexual violence, and 1 in 3 had been subjected to in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence. So we know that the dating app facilitated sexual violence is not an isolated or a singular incident. So we did find that a lot of people were being repeatedly victimized. They're experiencing the same behaviors from multiple people. They're experiencing multiple different types of harm. And finally, LGB plus respondents reported the highest rates of dating app facilitated sexual violence.
So obviously the focus of this research was looking at adult users' experience of sexual violence in person and online. But we wanted to tap into a bit of a niche, looking at how dating app users had received requests from other users to facilitate the sexual exploitation of children, either their children or other children they had access to. Our paper, which is actually available now on the ARC website, along with Heather's paper. So feel free to head to arc.gov.au. After this event, you can download these papers and have a bit more of a read. And in Heather's paper as well is the full survey instrument, so you can have a look at exactly which questions we asked of people. So even though this is a bit of a niche, it's not that we're just asking these sort of questions of people out of the blue. Dating apps have been implicated in child sex trafficking, where the sex traffickers are targeting victims using dating apps, but they're also posting advertisements for the sexual servitude of these children on these sort of dating apps and websites. Also some research that Sarah and I did last year at the Institute, where we published looking at child sexual abuse live streaming. So these Australian men who are sending money overseas, primarily to the Philippines, to children and traffickers over there to view the sexual abuse of them live over a webcam. We actually found that these Australians are connecting with victims and the traffickers using dating apps and dating websites. In addition, some child sex offenders may actually seek other adults and pretend like they're interested in forming a relationship with them, but really their purpose is actually just to gain closer access to these adults because they've got children that this sex offender seeks to abuse. So they're really doing it under this guise. And it's not only these sort of external individuals that are exploiting children, but also parents themselves. They may actually be exploiting their own children or other children they have access to, particularly if they're in really vulnerable positions, to gain things like food, shelter, or money. And that was particularly pertinent in our child sexual abuse live streaming research as well. People in poverty situations are really likely to do this sort of thing. And you might think that parents exploiting their own children is actually, a real minority of cases, but what the evidence actually says is that biological and extended family members are the offenders in large proportions of child sex trafficking cases, and as well as child sexual abuse material cases as well. So to tap into this a little bit more, we asked our respondents if someone they'd met on a dating app or website at any point through their time using these platforms had asked them to send them photos of children or other children they had access to. And then on any of these occasions, if the respondent was pressured to provide sexual images of these children. We also asked if these respondents had received requests from these other people they met on dating apps and websites, if those other people could meet the respondent's children or other children they had access to before they felt it was appropriate. Also, whether respondents were asked questions of a sexual nature about these children, for example, if they've had their period yet or their breast size, that sort of thing. And then we also asked respondents if they'd ever received offers of payment for photos and videos of these children, or to have them perform on webcam, so for live stream purposes. Now, in terms of children, we simply refer to them as anyone under the age of 18 who is the respondent's own children, whether it's biological or adoptive. Other children they had access to, say, for example, students. So if the respondent indicated in their dating app profile that they were a teacher, for example, that would imply that they had access to children who are students of theirs. Also looking at younger friends under the age of 18 and younger family members under the age of 18 as well. So in total, 12.5% of our entire sample of 10,000 individuals had received at least one request of these 5 requests. They had received at least one of these seeking a request to facilitate child sexual exploitation. Most of which were individuals just being asked for photos of children. Now, this might seem a little bit benign, but I'll get back to that in a second. Of these, about half of that 9% were pressured then for sexual images of children. 8% had received someone asking to meet their children before it was appropriate. About 8% received questions of a sexual nature about these children, and 7% had been offered payment for photos, videos, or webcam of these children. And I also just want to mention as well, this doesn't imply that this 12.5% of our sample actually exploited their own children, rather that they just received a request of this nature. We didn't capture any data on how many respondents follow through with these sort of requests and provided this sort of material to people, simply if they just received requests. So as I mentioned, just being asked for photos seems a little bit benign, but of this, nearly 1,000 people who said they'd been asked for photos of this nature, as I mentioned, half were then pressured for sexual images. 70% were then asked for the person to meet their children before it was appropriate. 70% were asked sexual questions about these children, and 60% were then offered payment for photos, videos, or live streams of these children. So some really high co-occurrence going on here, which suggests that just being asked for photos of children, it might seem not that bad on the surface of it, but it might be part of this really extensive grooming of people trying to get access to the exploitation of these children. So interestingly, we found that men were more likely than women to receive these requests as well. This sort of goes against a lot of the technology facilitated sexual violence literature, which finds that women are more likely than men. But what we see here is that men were quite a bit more likely for all 5 questions to receive them from other people they'd met on dating apps and websites. And in some cases, this was nearly double. So if you look over at questions of a sexual nature, it was about 10% of men compared to about 5% of women receiving requests of this nature. Now, again, disaggregating the sample similarly to how Heather did it, where we're splitting up the heterosexual and LGBT plus respondents, and according to their gender, we find a very similar pattern going on here, where the LGBT plus respondents are more likely than heterosexual. But unlike Heather's, where it was LGBT plus women, we find that LGBT plus men were more likely than any other group of individuals to receive requests of this nature. In addition, we find that heterosexual men are almost on par with LGBT plus women to receive requests of this nature, and heterosexual women are actually the least likely to receive these requests. Now, we don't fully understand why LGBT plus men in particular seem to be being targeted by this. It could just be an artifact of the fact that LGBT plus people are more likely to experience violence on these sort of platforms, and LGBT plus people are more likely to use these platforms and use them more frequently as well. But we don't really, as I mentioned before, we don't know anything about the perpetrator of any of these sort of harms. And looking on the surface of it, where we've got heterosexual men, it's very unlikely that it's actually heterosexual women approaching heterosexual men for this sort of material. So there could be some sort of catfishing going on, for example, where men are pretending to be women and asking other men to provide this sort of material. But unfortunately, we're unable to really comment specifically if that's going on or not. As I mentioned before as well, we sort of had 4 different categories of children that these requests could be directed at, whether it was the respondent's own child, other children they had access to, younger friends or family members. And typically what we see is that the respondent's own child is far and away the most likely to receive requests of this nature as well. And what this could be is almost like a situational thing going on, where respondents might have photos of their own children in their profile or indicate that they're a parent in their profile. And as a result, if people see that on their profile, they might issue these sort of request at the respondent, directed towards the respondent's own child, whereas probably a bit less likely that the respondent will be talking about other children they've got access to or younger friends on their dating app profile as well. So just in summary, sort of three real main findings of this. As I mentioned, 12.5% of our sample who use dating apps and websites have received requests to facilitate child sexual exploitation. In particular, the LGBT plus respondents and men are more likely to receive these requests than heterosexual respondents and women. And importantly, these really seemingly benign requests for photos of children from other people might actually escalate into really more overt forms of requests looking at child sexual exploitation. So what does this mean? Particularly parents and anyone really who's using a mobile dating app or website needs to be aware of the really lifelong severe harms that are associated with child sexual exploitation. In addition, anyone who's using these apps should really be quite wary and cautious about sharing any information about children they might have access to, whether it's their own children or if they're a teacher. Really need to be cautious about putting this sort of information in your profiles, because we see a really high proportion of dating app and website users are receiving requests of this nature. And finally, there's some implications for the platforms themselves. So if they increase, the warnings, for example, by putting pop-ups and providing more safety measures to users, it might actually prevent this sort of thing from being as common as we've found it to be. But also the platform should make it a bit easier for people to report such requests as well. There's often quite easy reporting methods for, illegal content or experiencing harassment from other users, but this real niche, as we see, is quite popular, but there's no real easy way for people to report it.